I'm the Associate Director at the Center on Disability and Development, and together with Dr. Christy Orr with Disability Resources, she's the Director. We are excited and happy to bring you guys Accessibility in Aggieland. This is a webinar series that began in the spring of 2021. We are beginning our fall session, and Andrew Barna Jr. is here to kick us off to talk about ADA in the workplace. Andrew is from the Division of Human Resources and Organizational Effectiveness, and he has quite a bit of experience, not only in his current role, but also as a presenter for Accessibility in Aggieland. We had great feedback, and we wanted to bring him back to share another session with you guys. Should you have questions throughout our time together, please use the chat function. Dr. Orr and I will be monitoring that chat function as we go along. And also Andrew Barna will be asking questions from you guys. And so please feel free to unmute yourself at that time. In the meantime, we do have the live captioning on, as well as we ask that you please turn your microphone off to help us with the accessibility. If you have any questions, again, please use that chat function. And I'm going to be handing the microphone over to Andrew Barna. Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here. First and foremost, I do apologize to everyone. Currently where I am in the middle of a thunderstorm. So if you do hear thunder, it is not my stomach. I did have lunch, but I do apologize for the weather conditions, so to speak. Happy to be here. I'm Director of Employee Relations, and I handle all the ADA requests. Originally it was just for staff. However, after working very closely with the Dean of Faculty, I also handle a vast majority of the faculty ADA requests that come in. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. The last thing that I want to do is talk for an hour. So I welcome anytime anybody has questions, raise your hand, put it in the chat, unmute yourself. I'll ask if anybody has questions throughout the course of the presentation. I'd really like to make this as interactive as possible. So with that, I will begin. Assuming I can get to the next slide. Here we go. Overview. What we're going to cover today is what the law is, what is a disability, what is a reasonable accommodation under the ADA, how does the process work, is it confidential, and who do I go for help? So first, what is the law? The law was actually, it's Bush Jr. and Sr., so to speak, play a role in the current ADA law as we know it. George H. Bush, passed the original ADA enactment, Americans with Disabilities Act, in 1990. The original enactment of the law was meant to cover access for people with disabilities to gain access to services within the community, whether that would be parks, buildings, restaurants, things like that, as well as the workplace, helping level the playing field for employees in the workplace. However, since the enactment of 1990 up until 2008, the EEOC did a very good job of kind of chiseling away at the effectiveness of the act within the workplace. They kept saying, no, it really doesn't require accommodations in the workplace. So therefore, in 2008, George H.W. Bush enacted the American with Disabilities Amendment Act, which further expanded upon his father's original enactment. This made it perfectly clear that this was applicable not only to public sector workspaces, but also private sectors. Everyone had to comply with the ADA regarding of the setting, whether it was an employment or social setting. System regulation 080102, which is the civil rights protection for individuals with disabilities, covers the university's response or regulation with regards to the ADA. It covers what the regulation entails as it relates to employment matters, not only employment matters for faculty, staff, student workers, but also with regards to students attending class in the educational environment. How to report conditions, what the interactive process looks like, the requirement for medical documentation, and it kind of defines what a reasonable accommodation is. We will cover all this in more detail as we progress through. But the system regulation 080102 is the guiding principle that guides how the ADA is interacted on this campus or within Texas A&M University, not only the university, but the system as well. What is a disability? It's any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits any major life activity or bodily function. It includes also within that definition, it includes a person with a history of disability or someone who is regarded as having a disability. It's actually word for word right out of system regulation, but I think it's important to kind of break it up into its various elements. What is a physical or mental impairment? It has to substantially limit either a major life activity or a bodily function. We will cover what those are. Trust me, the list is expansive and exhaustive. I'd be hard pressed to find something that would not qualify. And it also includes a person with a history of disability or someone who's regarded as it. Major life activities include standing, sitting, seeing, breathing, walking, pulling, thinking, eating, concentrating, everything under the sun. Anything that anybody would do on any given day is considered a major life activity. So if in any way you have a physical or mental condition that directly impacts one of these major life activities, or even one that's not necessarily covered on the list, again, I'd be hard pressed to think of one that isn't, you would qualify for an ADA potential accommodation under the Act, as well as the system regulation. Major bodily functions include the immune system, sensory organs, skin, normal cell growth, digestive, bowels, bladder, everything from your nose to your toes and everywhere in between is considered majorly bodily functions. So given the parameters of a major life activity and a major bodily function, it's pretty all encompassing and inclusive system where if you are impacted in any way, you would qualify under the ADA as well as system regulation for potential ADA protection. Anybody kind of went quickly through that because I know this is where the kind of rubber meets the road going forward. Does anybody have any questions before I kind of get on to what an accommodation is? Feel free to unmute yourself. Anything? Okay. An accommodation. A reasonable accommodation is any modification to the work environment or the way that the work is performed that allows the employee to do the essential functions of the job that they were hired to do, or gives them access to benefits or privileges that are enjoyed by other employees. What this basically means is if there is a way or a mechanism that allows a person with a disability, which can be either physical or mental, or somehow limits a major life activity or a bodily function, it gives them the same protection or helps level the playing field with every able-bodied employee. The key things to take away from there is that the employee still must perform the essential functions of the job. Those essential functions are what you were basically hired to do. Now, a lot of times what I will see is someone submitting an ADA request for accommodation for a reduction in either hours or effort. And these are not accommodations under the ADA. because you're not providing the essential functions of the job. If you were hired to work 40 hours a week, but you can only do 30 hours a week, you are not performing the essential functions of your job. Now, if you can perform 40 hours worth a week, but we need to kind of spread it out and not so much between the normal 8 to 5 time period in the day, we have to expand it from maybe 7 a.m. to 6 in the evening to give you time for rest to perform those essential functions. That would be a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. Giving you extra time in which to perform those functions would be an accommodation. Access to benefits or privileges, if you are handicapped and have this difficulty being able to move around the workplace and get to certain areas of the workplace, it is incumbent on the employer to make those benefits that would otherwise be available to able-bodied individuals. They need to put in a mechanism in which to allow the person with the disability to access those. So if there is a little bit of a step leading into the break room, the management would have to either put in a quick little ramp or some other way to make it feasible or easier for a person with a disability to access the break room or bathrooms or functions like this. So there's a lot of different ways in which that can be done, which is more handled on a case-by-case basis. But the basic principle is behind a reasonable accommodation, it must be reasonable. Reasonable is kind of a loose definition. Cost generally is considered a factor when talking about reasonableness of an accommodation. But the key thing to take into consideration is the employer. What is reasonable to an employer? Since Texas A&M is a $2 billion entity, what's reasonable for a department, even with a smaller department with a smaller budget, may say, hey, it's unreasonable for me to have to put a ramp in leading into the building. But the courts don't necessarily look at the reasonableness of the department level. They look at the reasonableness of the entire organization, the organization being the university. Therefore, a $2,000 ramp to put in would not necessarily be unreasonable for A&M to do. Any questions on reasonable accommodation? We have COVID going on. Please, you have to have something. I will be more than happy to address any questions you have as it relates to everything that's kind of currently going on to the best of my ability.
I would say also just a quick, if anyone is concerned, maybe doesn't want to put something in the chat or unmute, you could also do a private chat to me. And then I can ask the question anonymously if that's more comfortable for you too. So I'll offer that up.
Nothing, Christy? Okay. ADA accommodations, reasonable accommodation. Who approves a reasonable accommodation? Well, that's a little bit of anybody. Department heads can approve it. Department heads have ability to review and make a determination what they think is reasonable, but their decision is not necessarily binding. They will kind of make a recommendation of what they can and cannot do. That gets coordinated through with my office. We have a little back and forth. Sometimes it's called the interactive process. A lot of times I like to meet with the department head before I meet with the individual filing for the accommodation, so I can get a little more facts and details so we can kind of work through it and see what they can and cannot do. And then what we usually try to do, if we're able to accommodate it, the meeting with the employee goes relatively quickly. We basically say, we've got your request, everything's in line, we're able to do your accommodation, and we would execute what's called the ADA 914 form, which would be codifying the accommodation, putting it on file. recording what it is, how long it's going to be good for, if there's any renewal period or reevaluation period, that'll all be documented in the document. If the department can approve or is willing to approve a portion of the accommodation, but has other recommendations on what they think would be less restrictive on them, what we do is then we will meet, either myself or a representative from my office will meet with the department head and the employee and kind of discuss different options to trying to achieve what the employee is looking for. At no point, I have to stress this right up front, at no point does the department head see the nature of the medical reason giving rise to the accommodation. All they know about is that it is an accommodation for disability covered under the ADA and what the nature of the accommodation is. They have no idea, never review the medical. I don't tell them what the nature of the medical is. That is all confidential. That's only to be shared with either the ADA coordinator, which I will get to in a second, and employee relations. What happens if a request is kind of denied by the department? I say denied, and no, we're not doing that. We go through the interactive process. We are unable to reach a resolution that works for both the department as well as the employee. What we do is then, if I can't resolve that, luckily I've had fair amount of success finding some other type of less restrictive accommodation that work for both the employee as well as the department, but occasionally we unable to agree on anything. Then it goes to the ADA coordinator. I will write up a summary that will go to the ADA coordinator, who is with the Office of Risk, Compliance, and Ethics. And they will make a determination on whether or not a less restrictive is reasonable, if the accommodation that the employee is requesting is reasonable, or if there's something we hadn't thought of that they think is proper to implement. They have that final kind of judgment over everything. I always say to the department, be careful. You don't want the ADA coordinator making a determination, because once they do, there's really no appeal rights for the employer. So you may not love it, but it could be better. You can control your outcome. Sometimes when decisions are made for you, you may not like the outcome, but you are kind of stuck with it. I say just be careful what you wish for, and try to work with the employee, but occasionally we do have to go forward and the ADA coordinator needs to make a determination. And that's what they specialize in. Those factors, they review everything and kind of really let past practice be the balance of what it is. Granted, not every position is the same. Facts and circumstances are somewhat unique in every circumstance, but they try to have the same overarching guiding principles implied. Any questions with regards to accommodation, kind of how the process works, what role supervisors or department heads play in it, what role HR liaisons or my office play in it?
I think I can ask a question. Can you talk a little bit about, are there times when maybe staff members go to their supervisor or end up working with you directly, and that they don't know what they need, but they know that they have a disability-related impact, and they're trying to kind of figure out what kind of accommodations they might need?
A lot of times, and a lot of this kind of people don't know the process. So a lot of times it doesn't start by filing with me. They come to the supervisor saying, hey, I have a problem. I'm struggling doing X, Y, and Z. I need help. What can you do for me? And a lot of times, sometimes the supervisor says, hey, you know what? Here's what we can do. For example, someone has a cleaner has a back injury and is having tough time moving around the vacuum cleaner. The pulling and pushing is very difficult for them. Okay, here's what we can do is maybe we can get you kind of a shop vac that's on wheels that moves around a little more freely and easily, and it still allows you to vacuum as you need to do, but it's a better, more efficient way of doing it. We get you the new vacuum, you're done. That never has to come through employee relations. That's something you kind of worked out locally, boom, you're done. Sometimes the more cumbersome, for example, with now the big thing, or we're seeing more and more requests, is people with underlying medical conditions looking to work remotely. That is something we're having to do. Sometimes we're kind of saying, I don't want the department making that call on what's really reasonable or unreasonable, given the parameters that we're back to work, full force, 100% occupancy. Not to say we can't. I'd rather see that go through the more formal process than get approved at a local level without actual review. So we are being consistent as an employer. We're not just allowing someone who has X injury in one department to be able to work remotely, where another department is saying, no, I need you here because of this, even though it's a same or similar type underlying medical condition. We really want to try to get consistency. So it's as consistency as possible. I never say fair or equitable because that's technically impossible, but at least as much consistency as possible. So simpler things, hey, a flexible work schedule, that can be handled at department level. Maybe a few hours of remote work at an department level, but an open-ended AWL, indefinitely 100% remote, I really want that to come through the more formal process through HR with the documentation getting reviewed. Not to say we won't accommodate it, but we just want to make sure there's an element of consistency across campus.
Great, that's super helpful. And I appreciate you bringing up some of the things that don't have to go to your office that can be done, especially something like a flexible work schedule that could be done for anyone. It doesn't even have to be for a disability related.
It doesn't have to be under this. I'm just trying to keep it under the disability act. But I mean, yes, everybody's got life issues that come up where, hey, the 8 to 5 doesn't necessarily work. Maybe a 9 to 5 does if they want to work through the lunch. That's a flexible work schedule. Or, hey, I got to drop my child off at school at 7. I really like to be able to pick them up. So if I drop them off and come into work and start at 7:15, can I finish at 3:45 or 4:15? That's a flexible schedule that we want to encourage. We want to be known as a employee-friendly employer. And this is something we are striving for and pushing for, because to be a employee-friendly employer, usually one of two things. We either have to be flexible or really pay people what they're worth. And being in public sector higher ed, that's somewhat difficult. We have not quite mastered that. But the little things of being flexible with our staff, knowing operationally what we have going on. Hey, it may be not something you can do every day. It really depends on operational needs of the department, but being able to flex a little bit goes a long way.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have questions about, I know Andrew talked a little bit about alternative work locations and some of the accommodations that are happening right now. Anyone has questions about that, feel free to chat to everyone or directly to me if that feels more comfortable.
And I mean, there's other alternatives short of a full AWL. It can be putting up plexiglass, even flexing someone's schedule so they're not there necessarily in peak times. They start earlier, maybe take a longer lunch and finish up later in the afternoon when a lot of people are gone. Moving their work location so they're out of a high traffic area is another accommodation we have done short of a full AWL. Because yes, a lot of people can work remotely. Not every position really lends itself to AWLs, especially in the fact is a lot of questions I've gotten as well. I've worked remotely for the last year and I worked really well. Well, you very well may have, because that position lended itself due to the fact that, hey, that department wasn't open for walk-ins. There wasn't as much foot traffic in there, or wasn't even open, period. But now that we're open for full business, there's more students on campus, we have to be more forward facing. So just because you were able to do it for the last year doesn't mean you can really do it going forward, starting in 10 days or so.
Great. So we have a question about accommodations in the job search process. So when staff members are hiring, how should those people who are hiring communicate about how to request accommodations? So we know that there may be people who are applying for positions on campus that need accommodations in that interview process. And is there any suggested way to communicate to applicants, you know, that they can express their needs for accommodation in the actual hiring process?
There is generally, even I think on the application, I think it does state if you will need any type of accommodation, things like that. A lot of people are concerned they don't want to be prejudiced against, is if I say I need this, they're going to exclude me. Federally, we cannot, just because they require a disability, we cannot treat them any differently than any able-bodied individual. So we cannot discriminate based upon the disability. First and foremost, that's please, if you walk away with anything, discrimination is bad, very, very, very bad. Whether it's in the employment process or once they are hired. So we cannot discriminate upon that. But if there is situations that come up either in the interview process, you can refer them to either my office or even the Disability Resources office, and they can help the applicant work through that. We've had a couple issues pop up fairly recently where people were having difficulty completing the online information. So they actually came into the HR office and somebody sat down with them and helped them complete the application online and submit it. So yes, we are open. We try to be as accommodating as possible and helping in whatever way we can.
And I will admit Tracy Foreman from my office asked that question, and she's been a hiring manager many times. So she might be planning that question, but I think one of the things she's done is to make sure to ask each step along the way, you know, if you need any accommodations, please let me know. And I think also being clear about what the interview process will look like. So giving them a schedule early on, you know, letting them know it'll be a Zoom interview with 4 people or something like that. So the more details that you provide, that'll help people know whether they will need accommodated or not. So if you're going to provide lunch, then they, you know, may need to say, well,
They may have dietary restrictions that they need. Yes.
Things like that. So they may not know what they need if you don't give them enough details about what that interview day will look like. Just a little thing to think about.
Yep. Any other questions, comments, anything? Okay. Reporting of a disability can take a wide variety. It can be short of anything: verbal, email, text, FMLA leave. Somebody submits an FMLA leave, and once they're kind of cleared to come back to work, a lot of times these can kind of get morphed into, and now it becomes an ADA type accommodation for a reasonable amount of time. They need certain things in the workplace to help them adjust because of the nature of the illness or injury. So it can take a wide variety of things. And also too, employees don't necessarily need to ask for it by name. If they allege enough factors that put the supervisor would be considered management on notice of a condition that may warrant an ADA, it kind of shifts the burden onto the employer to put them on notice. Hey, if you need something, you take advantage of the ADA. Here's the forms. I need you to complete this, and then I can help you. Or, hey, I see you're struggling with this. Is there anything I can do to help you? Again, a lot of times it can be more informal resolution, getting that special vacuum cleaner, lowering the desk, moving the desk in certain ways so it gives them more flexibility of being able to move around the office. little things, don't need to go through the formal process, but sometimes if it's a bigger situation, you want to give them the documentation, let employee relations know, let your HR liaison know if you're uncomfortable having that conversation because you don't want to go down you don't want them to divulge what the medical condition is. There are offices, my office, your HR liaison, we're trained in this. We can receive the medical documentation. We can have those difficult conversations with employees. But if you know there's a problem and you don't do anything about it, it puts the supervisor, it puts the university department in a very difficult situation. So when in doubt, let either your supervisor know, more importantly, let your HR liaison know, let employee relations know what's going on so we can intervene. And a lot of times it may not be a reasonable accommodation that can really be done. It could turn into an FMLA type situation, which either way, it kind of removes it more out of the supervisor's hands or co-worker's hands. Even if you're hearing from a co-worker that's an employee is struggling, be proactive, try to get out in front of it, let someone know, just don't sit on the information. Well, they didn't ask for anything, so I didn't do anything. It's a somewhat of a defense, but it really becomes a rebuttable defense of, well, what did you really know? When did you know it? The law doesn't really allow us to put our head in the sand and ignore the problem, even though, hey, they didn't ask for anything, so we didn't have to do anything. Not really the way when the law was written, but unfortunately, it's not the way the courts have now interpreted. It's really become a employee, and rightfully so, benefit that it's going to put a more stringent onus on the employer because they know the law. We're not expecting employees to be as familiar with the law as, say, someone from my office or an HR liaison would be, or even a supervisor who sat through an ADA training. So it can take a wide variety of things.
We do have a question about paying for accommodations. So I know some of the things we've talked about, there isn't a cost involved, flex schedules, there's no cost, but there can be accommodations that are needed in order to have access that do have a cost associated. So if there's some specialized software or equipment or a desk or something like that, is the department responsible for paying for that? What if the department doesn't have the funds to pay for that? How does that work?
Yeah, great question. It does factor in. Cost is whether or not it's reasonable or unreasonable. Like I kind of said before, if it's a small department doesn't have the budget, that's not necessarily going to be the situation. And we can work with the department to get in touch with the finance people saying, hey, you really got to make this accommodation. We need to get this software. Yes, it costs $2,000, but it's reasonable under the circumstances, given the sheer size and complexity of the organization. And quite frankly, we may have licensing an agreement with that software because just given the sheer number of employees, it's not unlikely that someone else on the campus has a similar type condition requiring a similar type of software. We have a lot of people that are visually impaired. So we do have access to screen readers and software that takes care of things like that. So just because you're looking at it, go, wow, I don't think the department can handle this $5,000 software or word processing software that would be able to transcribe it because they have difficulty in using their fingers and type. There's a good possibility that we can find it, bringing it forward to employee relations, bringing it forward to disability resources. We can find you help in coming up with either the money or the software in question. Or, hey, yes, that one costs $5,000, but we have the one that works just as good and it only costs $250. Well, that may be a reasonable accommodation given the circumstances to at least try the cheaper software before we go to the very expensive Cadillac system, so to speak.
And that would be a good reason to bring things to your office if there is a request where it is something that could be more fund intensive to bring it to your office because you have that knowledge of what's available or can help do that research or help find funds if they're needed.
Or just having the conversation with the money people saying, hey, you got to find it. Shake over the cushions. We got to find the money. This is a reasonable accommodation, as opposed to the supervisor going and saying, hey, they need it. I really got to get it for them. Now, on the flip side, where I've seen a couple things with regards to equipment, things like this, is with regards to AWLs, furnishing home office space for ergonomics and things like this. Now, this is a little bit of a trickier type situation. Now, if it is done for the employee's benefit, not under the ADA, the AWL is being issued as a workplace, I don't want to use the word accommodation because that's going to confuse things, a workplace modification, increased flexibility, enhanced productivity, things like that. There is no obligation for the university to provide an ergonomic chair or a raised desk, something like that, because we'd say, well, you come to work in the office, you have that equipment, come to work, use it here. Now, if the ADA accommodation is to work remotely because of an underlying medical condition that puts you in increased risk or for COVID, and you also have a back problem. Well, now, yes, that providing that special ergonomic chair may be reasonable to provide that in the home office, seeing that's where they're working due to another ADA medical situation. So it kind of gets in the gray area. If anybody has any questions as this issue comes up, please feel free to reach out to myself or employee-relations@TAMU. It's on the end slide on the presentation. Feel free to reach out. We can have a conversation and we can walk through the more specific details surrounding that. But it's not always clear what we need to provide. Any other questions before we kind of go on? Denying an accommodation. If an accommodation, either the employee's accommodation or an alternate accommodation, kind of that interactive process where we're discussing different alternatives, maybe trying to find that middle ground on what will work for both the department and the employee. If we are unable to reach a resolution at that point, it goes to the ADA coordinator, who will make the final decision on whether or not the accommodation is denied, modified, or approved. So they kind of have carte blanche to kind of fashion any remedy that they see that would be appropriate. Generally speaking, they don't like forcing something on an employee, like saying, well, you asked for this software, well, we're not going to provide you software, we're going to give you X software. It's usually more of, well, we can't give you what you wanted, you insisted on that, it's unreasonable, it's denied. Occasionally, they will say, hey, we will try this for a specific time period, reevaluate it, and then find out if it's something we need to reevaluate after a trial period. So, but the ADA coordinator does really have the final say on whether or not the accommodation is approved, denied, or modified. Any questions? Is it confidential? Absolutely. Confidentially just doesn't mean the medical records. The fact that someone applied for or was granted accommodations is confidential as well. So if an employee asks, why do I have to sit at the reception desk again? Jane never has to do it. Do not say, because Jane has a reasonable accommodation and just live with it. No, don't say that. Just something generic. Hey, this is an HR issue. This is HR has dealt with this, and this is the way it is. Or it's departmental policy not to discuss another employee with another employee. Something, feel free to blame HR. That's always good. whenever they say HR, hey, I can't talk about it. It's an HR issue. They're aware of it. They signed off on it. Please feel free to blame us. But at no point do we want to look like we are retaliating against an employee for going through the ADA process and granting an accommodation where now they got the accommodation, they're working it, but we're taking adverse treatment against them by saying, hey, see what they got? See what that is, to put them in an uncomfortable situation where it can be seen as retaliation. So we always want to make sure we try to protect the individuals from feeling that either shame in coming forward and asking for it in the first place, or when we do grant it, making a kind of spectacle of them. That's going to get us in extraordinarily hot water. So when in doubt, the less you say, the better off we are. And when in doubt, always say, it's HR, you need to discuss that with HR. Or HR told me I can't really discuss it. Questions? And again, if paperwork does get submitted to you for an ADA accommodation, you being either a coworker or a supervisor, someone in the chain, immediately forward that along to either your HR liaison and or my office. Not that you shouldn't get it, not that you can't get it, you really shouldn't get it. You shouldn't be aware of employees' medical history or documentation, but occasionally, hey, they share it with you. You can politely ask them, hey, maybe it's better you don't share your health information with me, or if they wanted, hey, no, I just need help in trying to figure out this is the issue I have going on. It depends on the level of comfort the supervisor has, but you do not feel obligated that if you feel uncomfortable hearing about the medical condition, just politely ask them, hey, I think you need to speak with HR. Why don't you take this up with HR? I'll walk you over to HR if you want, or I'll get you the contact information for HR. Who you need to speak with. This is something you really need to address with them. And please don't just assume they're going to do it. Give us the courtesy of just saying, hey, I spoke with them about this. They said they were going to talk to you, but you may want to reach out to them. And it really removes the onus off of you. You've done everything, and actually more than we would expect you to do in that circumstances, but it at least closes the loophole, because again, people are somewhat reluctant to come forward or ask for things because they don't want, there's a fear that they're going to be discriminated or retaliated against for asking for something. And we try to want to remove that as best we can.
I would add, Amy, one thing that we've done is if someone, because a lot of times as a supervisor, people, your staff will approach you and start kind of telling you more than you want to know. And if it's something that you feel like does need to go through the process, we have asked our HR liaison from our department or division to reach out to the employee. And we just tell them, we don't want to know any of the details about, that kind of information. That's your private information. And then we, tell them that the HR liaison will reach out, and she can then provide the forms and, talk to you if needed. So that way we're kind of removing it from any kind of, anyone who's in the chain of supervision of that person, because we don't want there to be any kind of appearance that we would treat that person differently.
Absolutely. And that's the best way to handle it. And again, the reason why I say HR liaisons are perfectly fine to talk to. A lot of people may not, even supervisors aren't aware who their HR liaisons are. So that's why I generally say, when in doubt, feel free to give me a call. I will loop the HR liaison into what's going on with it. But I just want to make sure that whoever's on this knows, when in doubt, HR liaison's perfectly acceptable to go to. I would encourage it, and they can loop me into it. But when in doubt, I'm perfectly acceptable going to me as well, or my office. But great point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and we do have another question, which is if a reasonable accommodation is not granted, and after that, at the workplace, the employee feels like they're being retaliated against. So they ask for accommodation, it's denied, and then they feel like they're being retaliated against. Who should they talk to?
They would go to CREI. That would be because they're going to say it's going to fall in one of two things. Even if they're request for accommodation is denied and they don't agree with it, they can file with CREI under 080102 for an appeal. Again, I'm not sure it's really going to go much further than that, but they can certainly do that. Or if they feel they're being retaliated against, because the retaliation is going to be based upon a protected class, the protected class being a disability, it would be referred to CREI. However, even if they came to us with the complaint, we would make the referral to CREI because they would be the appropriate office to investigate it, because it's retaliation based upon a protected class, the protected class being the disability. And again, a lot of times people are upset. They think it's reasonable what they're asking for. Again, the classic situation where I've seen is people want a reduction in hours or effort. And that's, you're not performing the essential functions which you were hired for. You were hired to work 40 hours. If you're only working 70% of the time, that means someone else is having to pick up that 30%, which could be an undue hardship on the department. Again, certain departments may have the flexibility and be able to reduce the person's effort down to 70% and accommodate that. I wouldn't do it under the ADA because it's really not an accommodation, but we do make, again, we try to be, even if it doesn't fall squarely under the ADA, we try to be as, and I hate using the word accommodating because it confuses people, we try to be as employee friendly as possible. If we can do something to help the employee, make their lives better or their employment easier, we want to do that, whether it's under the guise of the ADA or just being a good employer. Any other questions? Kind of some final thoughts. Recognize when you have an ADA request. There's no magic words. No, they don't have to ask for it by name. There's no time frame. They can kind of hint to it and then proceed working about it. But if you see deficiency, we should try to be as proactive as possible. But this is not something we have to play, hey, you didn't ask it for by name, I don't have to do that. No, we want to be as proactive as possible. If you see there's a problem or people or the employee is hinting that there's an issue, they need help with something, even though they may not know exactly what it is, let your HR liaison know, let employee relations know. Look for the clues. Intermittent FMLA is another one that kind of, FMLA, ADA, they kind of can go simultaneously. Someone could have intermittent FMLA as well as an ADA accommodation on file as well to help given the medical nature, circumstances, things like this. A lot of times even courts have taken FMLA and kind of automatically converted to an ADA. Oh, they needed 12 weeks, but it needed a little extra time. Well, it's reasonable to give them an extra 4 weeks of leave to so they can get better and return back to work. Not that I necessarily agree with that. FMLA is a leave program, ADA is a workplace accommodation. Leave, by definition, you are not performing essential functions of your job. That's a whole different other thing. That's a legal semantics issue, but that's just the way courts are going. And as you can see it, courts are generally more employee friendly, employee centric. So be mindful of that. Don't try to stick to the letter and spirit of the law, because originally it was meant to cover long-term disabilities or permanent disabilities. It's morphed over time where that's kind of fallen by the wayside. It now covers, by definition, temporary disabilities, where if you look in the law, it was explicitly excluded temporary disabilities. The classic situation being pregnancy. Accommodations under the ADA. By nature, a pregnancy is a temporary disability, a short, finite period of time. But courts have said, yeah, no, that falls under the ADA. So we do have to be mindful that everything is constantly changing and evolving. So we're not expecting you guys to be the experts on it. Just know when there's an issue before, just bring it to the appropriate authorities, whether the HR liaison or employee relations. Sudden performance deficiencies is another key indicator that something may be wrong. Something is out of whack. You have a great employee that all of a sudden can't function or is having a tough time with some elementary or rudimentary task. Asking questions, is everything all right? Is there anything you need? Is perfectly fine. You're not getting into the nature of any medical issues. You're just having that exploratory conversation because you don't want to lead it to either a memo of expectation or potentially discipline if it can be solved by just having a conversation, which will open up the dialogue to find out if there's some type of accommodation that can be done. Key thing is you're focusing on the essential job duties. Be creative. Think outside of the box. How can we help this employee perform those essential functions? Moving schedules around, moving desks around, kind of positioning it in different things, even moving the entire office dynamic around. So increases flexibility and movement. Perfectly acceptable. Questions? Anything? Final thoughts, really takeaways. Don't retaliate. Don't give the perception that you're discriminating against someone. That's going to be a fatal error. Maintain confidentiality. Follow the process. The process is there for a reason, and be timely. And if you have questions, it's perfectly fine. Reach out to individuals. If you're not sure, just reach out to your HR liaison. Make them aware. Make me aware. Feel free to ask questions. And if you know something, do something about it. Be proactive. Any other questions? Anything?
Any questions before we wrap up? I know Megan may have a couple just announcements here at the end. I did want to add to, I think there were a few times in there where Andrew talked about, basically, I think another takeaway is just thinking about the fact that it's really a matter of employee success. When they're asking for an accommodation, the vast majority of people asking for that are because they want to be successful in their job and they're struggling for some reason. So, you know, being creative and sometimes thinking outside of the box, and sometimes it's not even a hard thing to do. It's just, you know, some of the things that he just mentioned about moving things around in the office or putting someone in a different office or just being really creative and thinking about it, because then it's going to increase the effectiveness of everyone in the office. If, you know, each person has what they need to be successful, then you're going to have a really high functioning office. So I think that's just a really good thing to think about. You know, sometimes there are people that have asked for things that seem unreasonable, and it can make you kind of feel like it can be a hard thing, but the vast majority of accommodations people request are really not that hard, and it's what they need to be successful. So I think that's just a good thing to keep in mind as you kind of think about this.
Absolutely, and I couldn't echo that more. It only takes one bad apple or one disgruntled employee to kill the morale in a department, making everybody's life difficult and miserable. And if you can avoid that, all for it. It helps prevent having to go down the progressive disciplinary path. So,
yeah. There
absolutely.
is a question about the definition of essential functions. So can the essential functions of a job change?
They certainly can. And it really kind of comes down to, I didn't go into it. There is a kind of a legal test of what really is an essential function. I didn't think it was necessary to kind of get into that level of the weeds, but essential function is basically what you were hired to do. There's only limited people that can do that job, and it would be unreasonably burdensome on the department if that work was not getting done. It's kind of the three-part test of what plays into essential functions. And absolutely, it certainly can be. Your job description, it's pretty encompassing, but generally within there's a bulk of what you were hired to do. Maybe some of the as needed duties, we can kind of reassign those as needed duties. But if you were hired to perform A, B, and C, and you're really not able to perform C or even A and C, well, that becomes an issue.
Yeah, thanks. And I think a good part of that too is the things that you talked about were really great, because there could be things in your position description that really might not be essential functions once you really break it down and look at it. So you might have being able to lift 25 pounds in your job description. But when you really look at the essential functions of the job, no one has to ever pick up 25 pounds, and you use dollies and, you know,
Whatever you need to do it, or if it only happens once in a blue moon, we can find somebody else to help you in that situation. But if you are required to lift things and you have a restriction, you are not able to lift anything outside of a pencil, that's a different story.
Absolutely, absolutely. So those are really good things to think about. We did have another question I want to get to real quick, which was
Sure.
About mental health. So if someone had to be hospitalized for mental health, the question is, would that be ADA or would that be FMLA?
It could be both. It really is probably going to be both, because it could be FMLA for the time they're actually hospitalized. That's going to be FMLA. Now, when they're released, they could be subject to some intermittent FMLA. But also when they are at work, it could be a situation that we need to put them in a more quiet, conducive space so they can focus outside of loud noises, things of that nature. So it realistically, in those situations, it's a combination of both. And it will be an element of leave or potential leave, as well as some type of workplace accommodation. Or the fact is, hey, I'm cleared to return to work, but I can only work in the office 3 days a week. I'm going to work from home 2 days a week. There we have obviously the ADAs coming into play. That a lot of things factor in it. Can your work be performed remotely is one of those factors where you get into those essential duties. But the long and short, it more than likely will be both.
Thank you. That's great. Megan, do you want to pop on and make any last announcements? We really appreciate everyone. And Andrew, thank you so much for this information.
Oh, my pleasure.
See, there's one more question that looks like popped up.
Yeah, real quick, that there was another question about long COVID. Is long COVID considered a disability under the ADA?
Long-term COVID side, definitely yes and no. I would say the COVID diagnosis is really not it's what I think what the COVID has intended to exacerbate an underlying medical condition, breathing difficulties, COPD. It could lead to something like that. So I think the long and short is yes, it would be considered a disability. I don't think it's going to be necessarily typed as a COVID, but it would be a COVID making an underlying medical condition worse.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, everyone. I'm going to be sharing a Qualtrics survey. This is an evaluation survey that helps Dr. Orr and I in making this webinar series better for you. And so if you would take a minute just to complete this form, I'll also send it via email, but while it's fresh on your mind, if you wouldn't mind taking that survey and giving us some feedback. Christy also helped you switch over the slides. I think maybe Andrew, you did that. Just
Yep.
share Andrew's information for employee relations if you have any follow-up questions.
I was going to put in the chat. I'm sorry. I was going to put my email in the chat too. My personal email.
Yes. Thank you so much. That'd be great. We just want to thank all of you for being here today. We want to thank you guys for taking the time to learn a little bit more about accessibility on campus. And we will be having a session the third Wednesday of every month. And so our next session will be on the post-secondary education programs here on Texas A&M campus. There are 4 programs that will be represented, and so we'd love it if you would come back to us. I believe, Christy, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it September 18th? And I'm probably wrong on the date. I'll put it in the chat function.
It is the 15th, September 15th is the next.
Okay, great. Thank you. So September 15th, that Wednesday, will be our next session. Again, it's on post-secondary programs at Texas A&M. In October, we're going to be talking with Dr. Laura Stow about disaster and disability and what that might look like in this pandemic here on campus. So that'll be a great one to come to as well to learn a little bit more. And then November, we're going to be talking about service animals and emotional support animals. Again, we thank you guys so much for being here today. Andrew, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your expertise with all of us today. And again, if you would take a minute to complete that survey, that would be very helpful. But thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Have a great day. Thank you.